So this is the iPhone XR, Apple's first budget notched iPhone, and because of this, it was an extremely popular phone. It amassed an almost cult following, and it was sold new for a really long time. However, seeing as it now has been discontinued by Apple and it is much cheaper, should you still buy the iPhone XR in 2022? I've attached timestamps if you want to skip around or just want to know something specific, but without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so first, as usual, we have the specs. The iPhone XR features an Apple A12 Bionic processor, 3GB of RAM, and of course, we are going to be talking more about what these mean later. It's got variable storage options at 64, 128, and 256GB, which I actually do think is a pretty good range, because a lot of people really do like that 128GB. Often they find that 64 isn't quite enough for them, but they don't need tons, so it's nice that that storage option is available. However, me personally, I got the 64GB version. It comes in several fun colors, up first for the notched iPhone line, with the usual black, white, and product red, along with blue, yellow, and coral, which is the one I have. And quite frankly, all of those colors look phenomenal. It weighs in at 194 grams, which is a decent amount for an iPhone, and it has a battery size of 2,942 milliamp hours. As for the key specs, well, that's pretty much it. We are going to be talking about things like the screen resolution and battery life later on, but I personally like to get this section out of the way as quickly as possible, so then we can get right into the real world performance. Next up, we have design, build quality, and button layout. The iPhone XR features that rounded off notched iPhone design, which was seen from the iPhone X to the iPhone 11 Pro, and despite this being the first budget notched iPhone, the design and build quality hasn't suffered. It features a glass front and back construction with an aluminium bezel and feels absolutely amazing. It features an IP67 water resistance rating, meaning it can survive in up to a meter of water for 30 minutes, and while I wouldn't recommend relying on this, it is nice if you've just come out the shower and accidentally get some water on it to know that your phone can survive that. In terms of button layout, this thing has got a pretty standard button layout for an iPhone of this era. A nice big isolated lock button on one side, a pair of volume up and down buttons, and a mute switch. All of the buttons still feel really nice and tactile on this iPhone, which is awesome. And yeah, I have very few complaints here. I have actually briefly talked before about how I used to have issues with this button layout, as I would accidentally take a fair amount of accidental screenshots, so my camera roll would just be crammed with screenshots of nothing. However, I did find I got used to it fairly quickly, and well, if you are coming from a home button iPhone, the lock button bindings may seem a little clunky at first. However, I found I got used to it very quickly. Now, I would personally recommend a case with this thing, seeing as it is covered in glass, so you really don't want to drop this thing without one. And I would also recommend getting this thing fully submerged unless you know that the IP67 is still fully intact. Overall, yeah, it's built like an iPhone, which is to say, super well. Following on, we have the screen, which was actually kind of controversial at launch. This is because the iPhone XR features a 6.1-inch liquid retina LCD screen with a resolution of 828 by 1792. And while this is certainly nothing to write home about, it's also not a reason to write this phone off either. Because of the screen size and the distance you would usually use this thing, honestly, the lower resolution really isn't that noticeable. And sure, the colors and contrast levels aren't as good as they would be on an OLED or XDR iPhone, but they still look pretty decent. Watching videos on this thing is a nice experience, it's a good size, and it's sharp enough to the point where I've never been distracted by it. The iPhone XR also features a typical peak brightness of 625 nits, so nothing stunning here. However, it is important to remember that this is an LCD panel, so it doesn't need to be as bright as an OLED panel would be. I've never had any trouble using this thing in bright lighting conditions. I've taken this thing all around, and again, I've never had any problems with it. One more thing that's good about the iPhone XR screen is simply how crowd-pleasing it is. 6.1 inches is the now de facto standard screen size for iPhones nowadays, as it's a nice blend between a big screen and being able to fit it in your pocket. And believe it or not, the LCD versus OLED debate is actually surprisingly active. A lot of people do say that OLED does tend to give them headache, so while unfortunately you won't get those nice deep levels of contrast like you would with an OLED screen, I do still think this is one of the most crowd-pleasing iPhone screens Apple have ever put into an iPhone, despite its lackluster specs. Often when buying a piece of technology, it is easy to get caught up in numbers and boxes, but realistically, this thing is totally fine. It's also got some more nice features too. For one, it features True Tone to keep your colors nice and balanced, and Haptic Touch for secondary interaction, which works great. Overall, as I said, it is very easy to get caught up in specs and numbers, and of course, while OLED or a higher resolution would be nice, I still personally do think this thing is totally usable in 2022. Next up, we have Face ID, which is of course the main unlock method for this phone. On the iPhone XR, it was faster than the iPhone X, so nice and snappy, and it works well in all lighting conditions. However, it doesn't have the expanded angles like we saw on the iPhone 11 or later. Quite frankly though, as long as you get a good view of your face, it will work nicely. After this, we have the camera, which is another interesting one, as this is the only notched iPhone that doesn't feature a dual or more camera system. Instead, the iPhone XR opts for a single 12 megapixel camera with an aperture of f1.8. In terms of actual performance though, the photos that came out of this thing are genuinely super impressive. You get really nice colors, detail, and dynamic range with a good level of sharpness, and honestly, while it would be nice to have a second focal length, I still had a lot of fun taking photos with this thing. It does also feature portrait mode, however, this is kind of limited. It only works on people, but nonetheless, portrait mode is always nice. The selfie camera is a 7 megapixel f2.2 system, and while it doesn't have the quality of the main camera, honestly, it's still totally fine for some selfies. In terms of video, this thing does shoot in 4K and up to 60 FPS, which is nice for some of that slight slow motion that I'm a big fan of. And while you probably won't shoot a movie on this thing, it does still look good enough for something like a YouTube video insert. The front-facing camera also shoots 1080p in 60 FPS, and while again, this doesn't look as good as the main camera, it's certainly good enough for something like an Instagram story. And hey, if you want quality, you can always flip it round. The iPhone XR does also, of course, feature slow motion video in 1080p in either 120 or 240 FPS. I used it to shoot this section that you're seeing right now, and while it may not look as good as the slow motion from my big camera, I don't think anybody really expected that. I did still have a lot of fun using it, so if you approach it like this, chances are you won't be disappointed. Overall, while this camera system does seem to be pretty bare bones, for most people's needs, it is absolutely fine. It's got great colors, great dynamic range, and so long as you find something cool to photograph, then you can get some really good images. Next up, we have probably the most important aspect of the modern smartphone, OS and app performance. In terms of OS support, this thing was released in late 2018, and it has been confirmed that this thing is going to get iOS 16. In fact, I just did a video where I used an iPhone SE, yes, the original iPhone SE, for like a few weeks. And seeing as the iPhone XR is much newer than that, honestly, I've had no problems with it. In terms of actual performance, scrolling through the OS, opening up stock apps, and performing system functions all work flawlessly, so no complaints here. In terms of more intensive performance, watching 4K videos on this thing is absolutely fine. I've had no problems there. I never found 4K videos lagging whenever I was watching something on the iPhone XR, and again, despite that not so impressive on paper screen, watching 4K videos on the iPhone XR was actually a pretty great experience. And when it comes to gaming, while it's not going to be as impressive as a modern iPhone, I have found that I can still quite comfortably play the Apple Arcade games that I like with minimal issues. Overall, while this phone is getting on a little bit now, because iPhones typically do have such a good support cycle, overall, while this phone is getting on a little bit now, iPhones in general do have a pretty good support cycle. And here, I'm pleased to say the iPhone XR is no exception. Okay, so quickly going back to the hardware, we have these speakers. The iPhone XR features a set of stereo speakers, so using both the top and the bottom speakers. And here, I'm pleased to say there aren't any issues with this technology like we occasionally saw on older iPhones. In terms of the actual sound, it's totally fine for watching some YouTube videos, and while they're not great for critical listening, we're just checking on some music, especially the crap I listen to. Checking her out. Come on! Yeah, honestly, they're totally fine for that. Finally, and appropriately last, let's talk about the battery life. The iPhone XR features a battery size of 2,942 milliamp hours, and while this isn't a mind-blowing number, as long as you get one with a good battery, then it'll actually be pretty good. This is not only due to optimization on Apple's part, but also that LCD screen we were talking about earlier. So while this battery may not seem huge for a modern OLED iPhone, remember, this screen is a lot lower resolution, and so the battery doesn't have to work as hard. I've generally found that I can quite comfortably get through my day with the iPhone XR, and while on heavier days I do have to plug it in the evenings, it is still usually fine. Okay, so summarizing, who should buy this phone? Well, I think the best audience for this phone is either someone who wants to try out iPhone without breaking the bank, someone who wants a backup phone, someone on a significantly older iPhone, someone who's on something like an iPhone 7 and just wants an upgrade without breaking the bank, or a younger relative for their first proper phone. Man, I wish my first proper phone was an iPhone XR. Mine was a Samsung Taco Lite. Alright guys, so that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Let me know, by the way, what was your first proper phone? Was it a smartphone? Was it a BlackBerry? Or was it the ever indestructible Nokia brick? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading those. As for now though, as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like the video if you want to see more content like this, then smash that subscribe button. I'm done for now, and I will see you guys in the next one.